Tomorrow, most of us will get a day off in honor of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. We honor Dr. King because he was a tireless proponent of justice. A son and grandson and great-grandson of ministers, King was a Baptist minister himself, and he could not reconcile what he had learned in his Bible about God's love for all humanity with the reality of life in America that was characterized by segregation, an unequal treatment of African Americans and other minorities. Dr. King spoke and wrote a lot during his lifetime, but the words most Americans probably remember come from his famous I Have a Dream speech given before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In it, he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." One could argue that Dr. King's dream has come, at least in part, to fruition. This new century has already seen the first and second African-American secretaries of state, the first African-American attorney general, and the first African-American president of these United States. But deep racial tensions still divide this country. The very public outcries over recent violence against unarmed black men by armed white police officers point not to new problems, but to old concerns that have been lying just beneath the surface of American life, waiting to be stirred up once again. Dr. King is known for his work fighting segregation in the American South, but his larger mission was to work for justice for all people. And while I Have a Dream soars to great rhetorical heights and has inspired generations of social activists ever since, I would argue that his letter from a Birmingham jail more completely expresses the ideals for which he stood. In 1963, just 4 months or so before he gave that I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King, along with many from his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, where they engaged with local men and women in a series of peaceful acts of civil disobedience in protest of the great injustices of segregation, which was the law in Alabama at that time. Inspired by the work of Mohandas Gandhi, Dr. King eschewed all forms of violent protest, writing that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends, and that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. In the course of his work in Birmingham, he was arrested and thrown into jail. While there, he received a copy of a local newspaper which contained a letter signed by 8 prominent Alabama clergy, among them the moderator of the Synod of Alabama of the Presbyterian Church, U.S. The letter accused Dr. King indirectly of being an outside agitator who was essentially hurting the ongoing negotiations for an end to segregation. Their letter encouraged negotiation and changes through the court system rather than the program of civil disobedience being encouraged by Dr. King at that time. While still incarcerated, Dr. King wrote what started out as a simple letter of reply to those clergy. In it, he rejected the notion of being an outside agitator and pointed out the interconnectedness of all God's people, writing, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham." In this letter, composed on the margins of that same newspaper and on scraps of paper sneaked to him by a jailhouse trustee, and eventually on notepads that his lawyers were finally allowed to bring to him, Dr. King wrote this: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." These are words to be carefully considered as we revisit the questions of justice and whether or not justice for all actually exists. Now, generally, when we hear the word justice, we think of folks getting what they've earned, receiving that which they deserve. If a person goes to school, works hard, and becomes successful, then we say that they've received their just rewards. And conversely, if a person commits a crime and goes to jail, we say that justice is served because that person got what they deserved. But when Dr. King wrote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he wasn't talking about people getting what they deserved. He was talking about people getting what they have a right to, or more precisely, people that were not getting what they had a right to. That all human beings have basic rights and freedoms is foundational to our very existence as a nation. The Declaration of Independence, which formally stated the intent of the colonies to separate from British rule, the document on which our very identity as a nation is founded, includes this statement: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he wasn't trying to say that people had earned those rights, but that they are self-evident, inborn gifts from God. But where men and women are denied the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, there is no justice. And Dr. King's words remind us that we cannot be content with justice here in our own lives if there is no justice for God's children over there, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There are lots of ways to work for justice, and certainly when Dr. King wrote these words, a number of groups espoused different approaches. While the Alabama clergy argued for patient, gradual change brought about by negotiation and through the court system, other groups like the Black Panthers urged violent means to bring about change. But Dr. King saw a third approach that centered on respect for all of God's children, the oppressed as well as their oppressors, an approach that dictated what he described as a more excellent way of love. In our New Testament lesson, the author of 1 John writes that those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God who they have not seen. The writer here seems to be inspired by gospel accounts of Jesus being challenged as to the greatest law, to which he replies that all the laws hang on these two commandments, that you love God and that you love your neighbors yourself. In his letter to the church in Rome, Paul writes that the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Ultimately, to love God is to love neighbor. And for Dr. King, we cannot say that we love our neighbor if we treat or allow him or her to be treated unjustly. Injustice takes on many forms. When Dr. King was active in the civil rights movement, Jim Crow was still the norm in the American South. There were different rules for different people, which is inherently unfair. And if you don't think so, just ask a fourth grader. But even though today we can point to changes in legal codes across the country that have, for the most part, put an end to institutionalized segregation, there are still different standards for different people. For instance, women are generally paid less than men. According to the Pew Research Center, on average, women in the United States earn 84 cents for every dollar earned by a man working in the same job. Gay and lesbian couples are not allowed the same recognitions and associated privileges that heterosexual couples enjoy. You may have heard that the Supreme Court has decided to take up consideration of cases from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, specifically a challenge to Ohio's ban on gay marriage. But when we look at the details of the case itself, we see a gross injustice. Two people who have been in a committed, monogamous relationship for 22 years wanted to be buried together in their family cemetery plot here in Ohio. That cemetery only allows family and spouses to be buried there. They were legally married in Maryland, but the state of Ohio does not recognize it. They sued the state of Ohio to have their marriage recognized so that they could be buried together. We've heard a lot in the news lately about controversial deaths involving Caucasian police officers and unarmed African-American men. Ferguson, Missouri was very publicly torn apart by protests and riots after a grand jury refused to indict the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown. But whatever your feelings on racial issues involving minorities and police authorities, it's hard to ignore this statistic. Again, source is the Pew Research Center. In the United States, African American men are 6 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated than Caucasian men. Undocumented immigrants come to this country in search of freedom and opportunity enjoyed by so many before them, but often they face legal and societal hurdles, and are stigmatized as lawbreakers and openly persecuted. Though slavery has been abolished as a legal practice in this country for a century and a half, human trafficking continues to be a worldwide problem. An article in yesterday's Columbus Dispatch described a raid on 3 massage parlors where 18 women were rescued from lives of forced prostitution right here in Columbus. One of those establishments was on High Street, according to Google Maps, about 3 miles from where you're sitting right now. The world's a better place than it was in 1963, when Dr. King was conducting nonviolent protests to end discrimination against people of color. But the work Dr. King started back then continues today. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King reserved some of his most withering and at the same time most heartbreaking criticism for the church. He writes, "There was a time when the church was very powerful, in the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. But their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often even vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Tomorrow, many of us will get a day off. Some of us will use that time to participate in service project to honor Dr. King's legacy. Some will use the time for much-needed break. Some will use the day shepherding children who've been given the day off from school. For many people here and around the world, it'll be another day of injustice, another day of inequality and oppression. So whatever you choose to do tomorrow, maybe some of that time should be used to consider what we as a church should be doing to work for justice, what we as a community of Christians can do to show our love for God by loving our brothers and sisters. Justice begins with love, you see. And love empowers us to share our lunch with a hungry stranger. Love gives us strength to swing a hammer for Habitat for Humanity. Love gives us courage to set aside our careers and our vacation to spend 1 or 2 weeks a year on a mission trip. Love gives us patience to teach someone to read. Love gives us the desire to make time to volunteer at our local hospital or serve meals at a soup kitchen or to be an advocate for someone who has none. Love gives us courage to write letters to our representatives in government, to march in protest of unfair treatment for minorities and those on the margins and those who have no voice. Love gives us the strength to take an active role in the public square for justice for all. It is the spirit of love that enables us to take the gifts that God has given each one of us, however small, however insignificant, and use them in the service of justice. Because justice anywhere can be the seeds of justice everywhere. To God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come. Amen.